Do you have faith in science? In our day, the word faith sounds anti-intellectual, but faith just means trust, and all of us trust science. However, some people take that faith too far and think science has made God unnecessary, or even unlikely. But is that true? Well, to understand the claim, we first need to understand what science is. Science is a powerful tool for understanding more about our world. Originally in Latin, the word scientia just meant knowledge in general. However, today, the word science has a different meaning. Science refers to the fields of study of the natural world. Fields of study about logical reasoning and numbers are not commonly called sciences, but rather called philosophy and mathematics, or sometimes they are called formal sciences, but they are not considered sciences in the common sense of the term. Today, science has a more narrow definition. So what is the defining core of science? Undoubtedly, the core is the scientific method. The scientific method is a disciplined way of testing claims about the world through empirical observation. The way it works is, first, observe something in the world and note its patterns. Second, you make an educated guess that attempts to explain that behavior. This guess is called a hypothesis. The hypothesis is not a belief, it's a testable claim. Third, you reason from your hypothesis to a falsifiable, testable claim. This is crucial because if a claim cannot be falsified, it is not scientific. Fourth, you perform repeated, controlled tests where you try to minimize the effects of other relevant explanations and isolate the explanation that you care about. These different explanations that could affect your results are called variables. Through those tests, you see if you can disprove your hypothesis. These tests are called experiments. You repeat the experiments to rule out alternative explanations. You always need to record the empirical data you've gathered. Then lastly, you see if the data matches your hypothesis. Then you refine your hypothesis and repeat the same process until eventually you've explained not just that single behavior, but also more broad behaviors of other relevant aspects of our world. This broader explanation is called a theory. Surprisingly, this is actually pretty fun and you can do experiments yourself. To help understand what the scientific method is better, we'll look at an example. You might want to learn about plants, so you watch them and notice that some plants appear to grow better in sunlight. Then you make a hypothesis that plants that receive more sunlight will grow taller or fuller than plants that receive less sunlight. Then to test that, you run an experiment. You get 10 of the same plant and expose half of them to sunlight 8 hours a day, and the others for only 4 hours a day. To prevent other variables from affecting your results, you plant the same kind of plants from the same seed packet, in the same pots, and the same kind of soil, and the same room with the same exposure to air, and watering them the same amount. The only different variable between the two groups of plants is their exposure to sunlight, which is called the independent variable, and the variables that are the same among all the plants are called control variables. Then every week, you measure and record your observations of the plants, like how tall they are and how full they are. After a few weeks, you'll review the data and see if your results support your hypothesis. If they don't support it, then great. You've learned something new and now you can rethink your hypothesis. If the results do support it, then great. You found evidence for your hypothesis. However, due to the nature of the scientific method, this process never fully confirms your hypothesis unless you can directly observe it. The experiment shows that the evidence points towards the result, but for most things, it can never prove the hypothesis with certainty. Maybe your results show that the plants that got more sunlight grew taller, but that doesn't mean more sunlight always equals taller plants. You can run more experiments and learn that sometimes plants can get too much sun and not enough water. There are a lot of variables you need to take into account, and with every experiment, you learn more about the subject matter and learn how to isolate the variables better. So far, what I presented is pure science, which is founded on very solid ground. The reason the scientific method works so well is because it cuts out speculation and focuses on the foundation of everything we know, our sense knowledge. So as long as you understand science and its limits, science is amazing. But what are those limits? Well, since the scientific method focuses on our sense knowledge, what it can discover is limited. This means that the scientific method only works for fields that you can observe for yourself. There is no experiment you can run to learn that 2 + 2 = 4. Science can only ever tell us about the natural world, and because it does that so well, some people have grown antagonistic towards fields like philosophy because they aren't natural sciences. The way philosophy is done is primarily through reasoning alone. There's no experiment you can run to determine the answers to questions like, how do we know anything at all to begin with? Unfortunately, some people dismiss philosophy entirely because it is not empirical. They can't use science to find out these questions directly, and so they conclude that there must not be an objective answer. But that's like looking for diamonds with a metal detector, and concluding diamonds don't exist because you're only finding metal. This belief is called scientism. Scientism is the belief that the only source, or the best source, of knowledge is through science. The main issue with this is that scientism itself is not a scientifically verifiable claim. There is no experiment you can run to determine whether science is the only or best source of knowledge. That's because the claim of scientism is itself a philosophical claim, and besides being self-contradictory, it is philosophically indefensible. The natural sciences themselves rest on certain philosophical assumptions. For example, science assumes what we discussed in our second Petra episode, that logic and mathematics are true and that our senses are a reliable source of knowledge. Science assumes that the theories they develop are true, meaning they correspond to reality and are not merely useful concepts. It also assumes that causation is real, the world is orderly, and that we are capable of understanding the world. All these things are philosophical assumptions that science makes but cannot prove. Science presupposes philosophy. It cannot justify its own foundations. In fact, science actually has its beginnings in deeply philosophical thinkers. Aristotle, who many people refer to just as the philosopher, was also a scientist, and he set up the foundations for the scientific method. These foundations of the scientific method were expanded by St. Albert the Great. He was actually St. Thomas Aquinas' teacher, and Father Roger Bacon also expanded on them. Both St. Albert and Father Roger were again deeply philosophical and religious Christian figures, but also extremely influential in science as well. Lastly, our modern empirical methods were created by Francis Bacon, no relation to Father Roger Bacon. Francis Bacon was also religious, and he is widely recognized as the father of the scientific method. He said that, "A little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion." Not to mention there are atheistic philosophers today who admit that philosophy is essential, like John Gray, for example. If you like deep dives like this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Anyways, the fact of the matter is most people today, including college graduates, don't have a deep knowledge of scientific matter. They know the stories, the discoveries, and experiments, and perhaps read a few books, but they claim to know what science teaches and even why it's true without actually knowing the why. Almost no one has repeated the experiments for themselves. And to be clear, that's not a criticism. It's simply a fact of life. No one has the time to repeat all the experiments of the past to verify empirically what has been discovered before. That's why we have scientists, and we trust what they report. But that's the thing. We have faith in what they report. Again, this is not bad. If you are in a position where you can only see A through C, and someone else can see A through Z, it makes sense to trust the person who sees more. Unless you have reason to think otherwise, it's not only reasonable to have faith in them, but it's the only reasonable thing to do. Faith in science, properly understood, is good and necessary. But this faith can go too far. To understand how, though, let's first look at how faith can go too far for people who believe in God. Some people have faith in God, but they never questioned if God is really speaking through their church, mosque, or temple. They never questioned if their scriptures are from God. They never questioned their priests, rabbis, or imams. So when they encounter evidence from science, without looking at the evidence, they will deny the scientific theory because of their faith in God. But if it's true that God exists and that their religion is from God, then nothing that religion says should ever contradict science. Truth cannot contradict truth. So they are not denying the theory because of their faith in God, but because of their faith in their favorite celebrity pastor, or their faith in their personal understanding of their scriptures, or their congregation. And usually, they think in such a way where they are very skeptical of science, and so the weight of the scientific evidence is reduced to a minimum. These kinds of people are usually called religious fundamentalists. And unfortunately, followers of scientism do the same thing. They claim they are just trusting the science, but they never questioned if the scientific evidence actually supports atheism. They never really questioned if their favorite celebrity scientist really knows what he's talking about in fields outside of science like philosophy, morality, or epistemology. They never questioned certain statements in their textbook that do not follow from the scientific evidence. For example, some psychology textbooks present certain experiments as disproving free will. These people don't question it, but take the book almost as scripture. Yet when presented with the blatant evidence of their experience that they truly do have free will or a nuanced understanding of the experiments, they disregard it because they say that they trust the science. But again, truth cannot contradict truth. They are not trusting in science, but rather the interpretations of their favorite celebrity scientist or their textbooks. And usually, they think in such a way that they are skeptical of philosophy, skeptical of their own senses, and dismissive of anything immaterial. These people are just like the religious fundamentalists, but flipped. They are atheistic fundamentalists. Human psychology has not changed, only the object of devotion has. So what's the answer? How do we escape fundamentalism? The answer is just be honest with yourself and seek the truth. Ask deep questions and genuinely think about them. Something I have found very helpful is to try to take what's useful from the scientific method and apply it to philosophical reasoning. So always try to disprove each claim as best as you can, and don't try to juggle everything in your head. Write down the arguments in clear, simple terms, then put them in the crucible. Remember, if you want to seek the truth, do not replace one unexamined faith with another. As Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So don't waste your life. Examine it. Albert Einstein actually speaks of this idea as well. He said, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." By religion, Einstein here meant an unwavering commitment to truth. Without that orientation, neither science nor religion can stand. So has science killed God? No, and here's why. Science only deals with what is observable, and God is not an observable object. You can make arguments for or against God based on things discovered by science, but these would be philosophical arguments informed by science, and not direct scientific evidence itself. In fact, the previous Petra video did that exact thing if you want to check it out after this one. So rather than science killing God, so far, science has only made his existence more plausible. But for many modern fundamentalists, they have replaced God with science. But before we end this episode, I would be remiss if I didn't deal with the God of the Gaps objection. Historically, the concept of God or the gods was used to explain phenomena like weather or the movement of the stars and so on, until science filled in those gaps. Whenever they didn't know something, they plugged God into a gap. Many people hear arguments for the existence of God today and assume that philosophers are still making the same mistake. But the arguments that survived and are still used today are fundamentally different. God of the Gap's reasoning says, we don't know how X happens, therefore God did it. It starts with ignorance and fills the gap with a divine placeholder. The classical philosophical arguments do the opposite. They use inference to the best explanation. They start with what we do know, reason about what the explanation must be, and discover that the description of the explanation matches what we call God. In other words, classical arguments don't say, God explains the gap. They say, given the data we already have, like contingency, causation, consciousness, morality, the beginning of the universe, what kind of cause could possibly account for those things? And the answer they arrive at is not a gap filler, but a necessary, non-contingent, immaterial, timeless, uncaused cause, the very thing classical theists call God. While the God of the Gap's arguments forces God into the unknown, philosophical arguments infer God from the known. They are not the same thing. In fact, today many of us suffer from a similar error in reasoning. This error is called the science of the gaps. When we see the abundant evidence for God from these philosophical arguments, the temptation is to plug science in to fill the gap. Regardless of what we can determine about what that explanation must be through reason, many people will just blindly have faith that one day science will figure it out. But that way of thinking is profoundly unscientific. A scientific mind would follow the evidence, and there are good philosophical arguments for God's existence. The most simple and common argument for God's existence is what we'll be covering next.